Welcome back. This is your curious European friend, and in this video I'm back with another geography video, this time about America's most powerful and ignored waterway that apparently holds the entire Pacific Northwest together. I figured it out after reading his video description because I do not know what this is about, which waterway, so let's find out together and what it does.
The Pacific Northwest is home to booming cities, massive agricultural regions, and huge industrial and technological titans. But absolutely none of it would exist without one single waterway, the Columbia River. It's a geographic marvel that carved through mountains and drowned ancient civilizations just to power our modern world. And today, this invisible giant dictates the entire West Coast power grid, high-stakes international treaties, and the survival of entire ecosystems.
So
why
for Canada and the US then. Okay.
does a single river control the destiny of the entire Pacific Northwest? I'm Jeff, and this is the incredible geographic story behind one of North America's most important rivers. This is the mighty Columbia River. It's the largest river in the Pacific Northwest, the fourth largest by volume in the United States, and it drains a massive watershed roughly the size of France. But to truly understand how this single river dictates life, economy, and power for millions of people, we have to check out where it comes from, because the physical journey of the Columbia River is one of the most bizarre, dramatic, and violent geologic paths of any river on the continent. Let's start at the very beginning. Far up in the Canadian Rockies, tucked away in the province of British Columbia, lies a small, seemingly insignificant body of water called Columbia Lake. At an elevation of over 2,600 feet, this pristine alpine lake is fed quietly by glacier melt and bubbling natural springs. It sits perfectly still and is mostly unassuming. You could stand on its quiet shores and never guess that the water lapping at your feet is about to embark on a 1,243-mile journey that will literally shape the physical landscape of the Pacific Northwest. But right out of the gate, the Columbia immediately breaks the rules of North American geography. When most people think of major rivers on this continent, they picture them flowing generally south or winding east or west towards the nearest ocean coastline. But that's not what the Columbia does. In fact, as it leaves Columbia Lake, it flows almost straight north. And it doesn't flow north for just a few miles. It travels north-northwest for over 200 miles, trapped in a massive geologic trench, confined by the towering, jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains to the east and the Columbia Mountains to the west. The river is locked in. It's gathering water, gathering speed, and heading entirely in the wrong direction for the Pacific Ocean. So, how does it escape from this mountain trap? The answer is a dramatic geographic U-turn that sets the stage for everything to come. At roughly the 52nd parallel, the river hits the apex of the majestic Selkirk Mountains and makes a sudden, sharp turn to the south. This hairpin...
How does it just turn, though? Like, is there something in the way to where it couldn't go its natural, like, north paths? Why does it suddenly do that? Is it just made that way? Did humans do that?
curve is known geographically as the Big Bend.
Big Bend. Big Bend.
From this point on, the Columbia transforms into a southward flowing powerhouse. As it cuts through British Columbia, the landscape is rugged, densely forested, and incredibly steep. The river drops rapidly in elevation here, building an immense amount of kinetic energy. Energy that, as we'll soon discover, human engineers would eventually find absolutely irresistible. After traversing over 400 miles of remote Canadian wilderness, the Columbia crosses the international border into the United States, entering northeastern Washington. Because this is the Pacific Northwest, you might naturally expect the river to continue flowing through lush, green, rainy alpine forests. But the geography of Washington state is about to pull a massive bait and switch. As the river winds its way south and west, the dense green forests simply disappear. Instead, they're replaced by a vast, arid, sun-baked landscape known as the Columbia Basin. This is a high desert environment, sitting squarely in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains. It's dry, dusty, and without the river, it would be almost completely barren. As you look closely at the towering basalt rock walls lining the river here, you'll notice massive, jagged scars. Huge, dry canyons
This is crazy. So, what? So naturally, there's supposed to be forests, but because of the river, it's dry? I'm confused. Or would you think that it has forests, but there's a river? Like, was there greenery before? I don't know when this river, I don't know if he said that, but I don't know when it came about. So, I don't know, but what?
Known as coulees, branch off from the riverbed, looking like they were carved by a waterway 10 times the size of the Columbia. How did those get there? They're the remnants of one of the most violent, cataclysmic geologic events in Earth's history. A history that literally ripped this landscape to shreds and forced the Columbia into its current path.
Okay, so I guess that answers it.
But that ancient catastrophe isn't just a prelude to the sheer volume of water the river is about to take on today. Near the Tri-Cities in Washington, the Columbia makes another major turn, heading west. And right here, it meets its most significant partner, the Snake River. The Snake is a massive waterway in
The
its
Snake River. Wonder why it's called the Snake River.
own right, having traveled over 1,000 miles all the way from the borders of Yellowstone National Park. When the Snake dumps its water into the Columbia, the volume of the river essentially doubles. It transforms from a large river into a churning, massive inland sea of moving water. Now, an incomprehensible amount of water is hurtling directly west, but there is a colossal barrier standing in its way, the Cascade Mountain Range. This is a continuous wall of jagged volcanic peaks stretching from British Columbia all the way down to California. Now, by all standard rules of geography, this towering mountain range should block the river entirely, either forcing it into California or trapping it to form an endless inland lake.
But I guess it doesn't?
But the Columbia doesn't go around the mountains, it goes straight through them. Over millions of years, as tectonic forces slowly pushed the Cascade Mountains upward, the Columbia River acted like a giant liquid saw. It cut straight down into the bedrock.
That's wild. I would not have thought that that was possible.
At the exact same rate the mountains were rising. The spectacular result is the Columbia River Gorge, an 80-mile-long canyon with sheer rock walls rising up nearly 4,000 feet from the river. As the river flows through this gorge, the arid desert is completely left behind, replaced almost instantly by the drenched, temperate rainforests of the Pacific coast. Emerging from the gorge, the Columbia glides past the Portland metropolitan area, slowing down and widening into a massive estuary as it finally reaches sea level. But the journey isn't over, and the river's final test is its most dangerous. Where the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean lies the Columbia River Bar. Here, the unstoppable force of the river's immense outflow violently crashes head-on into the immovable object of incoming Pacific Ocean swells. The result is one of the most treacherous, chaotic, and deadly stretches of water anywhere on the planet. Nicknamed the Graveyard of the Pacific, it's a violent end to a magnificent journey. But while the physical path of the river is a marvel of geography, it's the human history built upon those churning waters that truly define the fate of the entire continent. Speaking of the Columbia River, if you're interested in learning more about it and Pacific Northwest geography at large, be sure to check out my field geography episode over on Geolex about the channeled scablands, where we are literally tracing the Columbia River as it goes through that dry and arid part of Washington state. It's a really fun video, and you can check it in the link below or at the end of this video. So go check it out.
The taming of a wild river.
For over 15,000 years, the Columbia River was the lifeblood of dozens of indigenous tribes, including the Chinook, Yakima, Nez Perce, and Umatilla nations. They didn't just live next to the river. Their entire civilization was built around it. And the undisputed heart of this civilization was a place called Celilo Falls. Located just east of the modern-day Columbia River Gorge, Celilo Falls was a spectacular series of cascades where the massive river squeezed through a narrow basalt canyon. But it was so much more than a geographic feature. It was the ancient indigenous Wall Street of the West. Every year, millions upon millions of Pacific salmon would funnel through these roaring falls on their way to spawn. Indigenous fishers built incredible wooden scaffolding out over the churning water.
Oh, that's smart. It's like a casino for fish, or casino of fish for humans.
Harvesting enough fish to sustain vast populations. Celilo Falls became the largest and most important trading hub in all of North America. People traveled from the Great Plains, the Pacific Coast, and even as far away as modern-day Alaska to trade goods, language, and culture here. It was a thriving, complex, and deeply interconnected world. But this 15,000-year-old way of life was about to be upended in the blink of an eye, because in the early 19th century, a new group of people arrived on the banks of the Columbia, and they didn't look at the water and see a home. They saw a highway. When American and European explorers, most notably Lewis and Clark in 1805, finally reached the Columbia, their primary goal wasn't to settle down. They were looking for the fabled Northwest Passage, a direct water route to the Pacific Ocean to open up global trade. While the Columbia wasn't exactly the smooth sailing route they had dreamed of, it quickly became the undisputed artery of early North American colonization. Soon, massive fur trading operations like the Hudson's Bay Company established strongholds along its banks, notably at Fort Vancouver. And quick point of clarification, this is the Vancouver in southern Washington state, not the one in British Columbia. The river was the absolute only viable way to move massive quantities of beaver pelts and heavy supplies through the rugged, impenetrable wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Decades later, when hundreds of thousands of American settlers pushed west along the Oregon Trail, the Columbia River was their final, brutal test. Pioneers literally had to dismantle their wagons, load them onto flimsy wooden rafts, and navigate the treacherous, deadly currents of the Columbia River Gorge just to reach the fertile lands of the Willamette Valley. But here's the problem with using a wild, violent river as your primary transportation and economic engine. It's incredibly dangerous and completely unpredictable. If you really want to build an empire, you can't just ride the river. You have to break it. As the 19th century bled into
Have to break it? What does that even mean?
the 20th, the region's population exploded. The newly settled Pacific Northwest needed electricity. It needed heavy irrigation to turn the dusty Columbia Basin into farmland. And it needed to stop the devastating seasonal floods that regularly wiped out entire riverfront towns. So, the United States and Canada essentially declared war on the Columbia River's wild nature. In the 1930s, the era of the mega dam began. Engineers embarked on some of the largest public works projects in human history. They built the Bonneville Dam near Portland to tame the gorge and generate massive amounts of power. Then, they looked upstream and built the Grand Coulee Dam, a concrete behemoth so incredibly massive that it's still the largest.
This is interesting. It travels downward.
Power producing facility in the United States today. By the time the dam building frenzy was over, 14 major dams spanned the main stem of the Columbia, with hundreds more choking off its tributaries. The sheer scale of this engineering feat is mind-boggling. They took a wild, free-flowing river that dropped over 2,000 feet in elevation and transformed it into a series of massive, stepped, stagnant lakes. In doing so, they created the battery that literally powered the modern Pacific Northwest. The cheap, abundant hydroelectricity generated by these dams built the airplanes that won World War II, fueled the rise of the modern aluminum industry, and laid the literal foundation for the massive tech empires that dominate the region today. But taming a giant comes at an enormous, irreversible cost. Remember Celilo Falls, the ancient cultural and economic heart of the indigenous world? In 1957, the gates of the newly constructed The Dalles Dam were closed. Within hours, the rising waters silenced the roar of Celilo Falls forever. It was completely submerged, drowning a 15,000-year-old way of life under a man-made lake. The great salmon runs were decimated, blocked by millions of tons of concrete. The river was no longer a living, breathing ecosystem. It was a highly managed, industrialized machine. So the wild Columbia had been conquered, partitioned, and put to work. But building this colossal water machine was one thing. Running it, maintaining it, and dealing with the massive international and ecological consequences of its existence, that's a completely different story.
Yeah, so essentially the river provides well, more than one thing, but the electricity and trade and all of this stuff. So because of this river, the Pacific Northwest really got to take off.
The Columbia River actively yet secretly dictates the daily life, economy, and future of the entire Pacific Northwest today, which seems like a tall order for a single river system. But you see, this river isn't just a body of water. It's a highly calibrated machine, and like any machine, it runs on a very specific fuel. For the Columbia, that fuel is called the freshet. Now, I'd forgive you if you've never heard of this word before, so let's talk about it. Geographically, the importance of this river peaks in the spring and early fall. Unlike rivers fed by constant year-round rainfall, the Columbia's true superpower is locked away in the high alpine snowpacks of the Canadian Rockies and the Cascade Mountains. When spring arrives and temperatures rise, millions of tons of mountain snowmelt dramatically and rapidly increase the river's volume. This seasonal water surge is the absolute heartbeat of the Pacific Northwest, and this is the freshet. This massive influx of water is strictly critical for our hydroelectric dependency. The region relies entirely on this spring surge to fill the sprawling reservoirs that lie behind 19 major dams spanning the Columbia and its primary tributaries. Capturing this exact seasonal flow dictates the region's water supply for the rest of the year. If the winter snowpack is light, the summer and fall will face severe energy crunches. The Columbia River essentially acts as a colossal, landscape-scale battery, keeping the lights on from Seattle to Boise. But what happens when a region's insatiable thirst for electricity directly collides with the survival of an entire species? This brings us to the most visible, deeply contentious annual conflict on the river: salmon migration. The spring flow isn't just a battery charge for human cities. It's the vital, narrow window for millions of juvenile salmon to migrate from their inland spawning grounds to the Pacific Ocean. They rely on the fast, heavy currents of the freshet to physically push them out to sea. This creates a devastatingly complex balancing act. Dam operators want to hold the water back in reservoirs to generate maximum power later in the year, but environmental scientists argue that the water must be spilled over the dams right now to ensure the salmon survive the journey. It sparks an intense, visible news debate.
Yeah, it could be great if there was like a sort of you know, when dogs have the I don't know what it's called in English, like the doggy doors, that they can go through the door. If salmon had that in the dam, but of course some water would still flow in as well. But if you could make something like that where a limited amount of water would travel with the salmon, but that they could still go through somehow.
Every single year in the Pacific Northwest. How do we balance clean, carbon-free energy generation with the ecological survival of a keystone species? For decades, the people making these decisions were strictly federal governments and power companies. But the balance of power is finally starting to shift. Tribal nations on both sides of the US-Canada border are actively fighting for a seat at the negotiating table. For over a century, the Indigenous peoples whose cultures were historically built around the river were largely excluded from how it was managed. Now, through tireless legal and political battles, they are demanding that Indigenous representation is permanent and that salmon restoration and ecosystem health are finally prioritized, rather than treated as an afterthought to cheap energy. And they're making this stand at the exact moment the entire rulebook for the river is being rewritten. Because the Columbia River ignores international borders, managing it requires unprecedented cooperation between the United States and Canada. In 1964, the two countries signed the historic Columbia River Treaty, an agreement that dictated exactly how water would be shared, stored, and released for power generation and flood control. Now, technically there's no expiration date for this treaty, but there is wiggle room in how it was able to be managed now that the treaty has surpassed 60 years. Today, the modernization and renegotiation of the Columbia River Treaty is a high-stakes, ongoing political issue. It's not an exaggeration to say that the outcome of these negotiations affects flood control for massive cities like Portland, Oregon, and the stability of the entire West Coast power grid. If Canada decides to hold back more water, or the US demands more flow for salmon, the economic ripple effects will be felt by millions. Which is so weird because, unless you live here in the Pacific Northwest, you're likely not familiar with the Columbia River at all. Certainly not in the same way that you are with the Mississippi, Colorado, or St. Lawrence River for Canadians. It's almost like the Columbia River has been forgotten. So why don't more people know
I never heard about it.
About this river? Despite its massive size and prominence, the Columbia rarely occupies the same space in the American and Canadian
It
consciousness.
is crazy to see how big of an impact that river really has. Or, just a river can have.
As other major waterways. We can break down exactly why into a few key comparisons. First, we have the comparison to the Mississippi and St. Lawrence rivers. These rivers are steeped in North American folklore, literature, and deep cultural history. They are massive, slow-moving highways of historic trade that pass directly through the continent's heartland, and they're each intrinsically tied to the foundations of their respective countries. The Columbia, by contrast, is tucked away in the far upper left corner of the map. It's massive, but really only important on a local level. And then there's the Colorado River, which is actually much smaller than the Columbia, but is constantly making national news. Why? Because it's in a perpetual state of severe crisis. It's drying up while simultaneously trying to sustain massive, thirsty desert populations in Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Las Vegas. It's literally a life or death moment for the river. The Columbia River, ironically, is forgotten because it works too well. It's an invisible giant. Most of its power generation happens in the sparsely populated, arid deserts of eastern Washington, or deep in the Canadian wilderness, completely out of sight from the millions of people in Vancouver, BC, Seattle, or Portland who rely on it every day. You plug your phone in, and it charges. You turn on the tap, and water flows. And so, the Columbia River quietly, efficiently, and relentlessly carries the Pacific Northwest on its back. And as long as the snow keeps falling in the mountains, this one river will continue to control the destiny of the entire Pacific Northwest region. This was a really fun exploration of the Columbia
that's
River.
crazy.
And if you want more
just how much, like I said, impacts a river can have on how much it can do for different communities, and how also, that was a good point, how we forget, just like we charge our phone, sometimes we charge multiple things at once, and you just have so much relying on like electricity. And I really figured this out, like of course you know that, but you don't really know that until, for me at least, I was in a power outage. It's just like then you realize, wow, I am really just so heavily dependent on electricity. It's crazy how dependent we are on it these days. And it made me think like, okay, I'm actually kind of grateful for this power outage, because I can kind of be grateful for when we do have power, but also kind of reflect on how much it impacts your life. And when you don't have it, you can also look inward a bit more and reflect on what you really do with your time and everything. But anyways, this was very interesting to see, because I never heard about the Columbia River, and what all it does, specifically for the Pacific Northwest, and how dependent that region is on it as well. And I think that's always an interesting kind of battle, when you see like human needs versus the natural needs, in this case for the fish, just the ecological side of it. I think that's a very interesting battle that we have dealt with and will deal with maybe more and more even as population grows. So I'm very interested to see how that will go over the years. But anyways, I hope you liked this video, and I hope to see you in my next video very, very soon.